At Home in North Branch by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 11. Fire! Len and I were awakened in the frigid early morning hours by the frantic clanging of bells. I clutched the quilts in horror. Len was on his feet and into his clothes before I could ask what was going on. "It's a fire," he said, "and it must be a huge one. Every bell in town is ringing." He looked out the window. "It's too far west of us to be the lumber mill," he said. "It must be the shingle mill." "Ugh," he groaned. "If only I'd gone with my instincts and gotten Jerome over there this afternoon." He pulled on a hat over his head and grabbed a scarf. "I'll run over and go with Pa," he told me. "If you want to come, hitch up Regal and get Ma." If I wanted to come? I was already clambering into my clothes and searching for my boots. "They're out here by the stove." Len's voice drifted back to me as the front door banged shut. I pulled on my mittens and dashed out to the barn. In record time, Ma Williams and I were in town and had found Sarah Jane in the crowd. Every able-bodied man and boy in town joined in the fight. They were greatly hindered by the fact that the river was frozen solid, so the only water available had to be hauled from the nearest wells. It soon became apparent that this wouldn't be enough to control the fast-moving flames, and many joined the businessmen in saving what they could from the buildings along the main street of North Branch. The fire seemed to travel the path of the railroad track, and as we looked back later, we thanked God that the homes east and west of the tracks were spared. Sarah Jane and I stood with other women and children across the tracks and watched the blazing buildings. One by one, roofs collapsed and windows broke with a sound like cannon shots. Men with blackened faces rushed past, carrying furniture and merchandise. Others tried to shovel the packed snow around still-standing buildings to halt the progress of the flames. There was no point in even trying to stop the burning at the shingle mill. The men's concern was to keep the entire town from being leveled by the vicious blaze. Some hours later, the early morning light revealed the burned remains of 11 buildings, including the hotel and the bank. George's Mercantile had been spared, as had the hardware and the livery stable. The post office still stood, and when the postmaster ran the flag up at daybreak, there was a cheer from the crowd. No lives were lost, and the weary firefighters prepared to return to their morning chores. The cleanup work would come later. As we waited for Thomas and Len, we stepped into the small railway depot, out of the biting wind. "This is going to be a very long day," Sarah Jane sighed as she sank down on a bench. "I certainly hope my children can get along without much help from me. I'll be lucky if I can keep my eyes open. Do you think any of yours will show up?"
"I don't know," I replied. "I'm sure they've all been out here as long as I have. If they weren't children, they'd all go home and go to bed."
"But they are children," Sarah Jane reminded me. "And they'll want to talk about what happened. Are you ready to figure out how many board feet of lumber were destroyed in a 5-hour period?"
"No, but Joel will be. That will be the very thing he'll suggest. I'm so glad Frank's store was spared, but what a tragedy for the others. I wonder how the fire started."
"I'm sure we'll soon know," Sarah Jane said. "There are no deep, dark secrets in a town like this." As we spoke, we were joined by other ladies of the town, including Gladys Burton. That good lady was fairly bursting with excitement, and the others gathered around to hear her story. Since their farm was the closest to the shingle mill, the Burtons were the first to be aware that all was not well. Gladys awoke in the early hours of the morning and sniffed the air.
"Zachary,"
she gave the poor man a brisk prod in the side.
"Wake up! I smell smoke. Did you turn the damper down on the stove?"
"You asked that before we came upstairs. You don't smell anything. Go back to sleep." Gladys subsided for a moment. Then, deciding that she hadn't been mistaken, she got out of bed and went to the window. The moon reflected brightly on the snow, and visibility was unimpaired. There was indeed smoke coming from the office building of the mill.
"Zachary!" she screamed. "There's a fire at the mill. Come here and look."
Zachary hoisted himself from his warm covers with as much speed as he could manage and limped to the window. For once you're right, he muttered, for as they watched, flames broke out on the roof. Better get some help. He grabbed his cane and headed for the stairway.
How far are you planning to get in your nightshirt? Gladys inquired. Get dressed before you go down there. What can we do anyway? By the time either one of us gets to the gauges, the place will be a pile of ashes.
We can't stand here wringing our hands, the old man retorted. I can at least clang the dinner bell. Someone will hear it and come. Frank Gage did hear it and leaped from his bed. There's a fire, he said to Dorcas. Can't tell if it's the Burton's place or the mill, but the wind is in the northeast and the fire will head for town, whichever it is. Dorcas ran quickly to ring their bell, and in a very short time the town was alerted to the disaster and help was on the way. Seeing the interest her story had created, Gladys decided to enlarge upon the circumstances. It wasn't often that she had the attention of almost the entire female population of North Branch at her command.
Just this afternoon, I saw Mr. Brewer and talked to him, she continued importantly.
She had been seated faithfully at her post in the front window.
Mr. Brewer is on his way back to the mill, she reported to her dozing husband. He works long hours over there. I declare we don't have a much more respectable citizen in North Branch than that man.
When he left the road to follow the path to their house, she prodded Zachary sharply.
He's coming here. Wake up. Mr. Brewer's coming to see us.
Zachary stirred and opened his eyes.
Then open the door and let him in,
he said irritably.
Don't sit there poking at me.
Gladys smoothed her hair in her apron and stood ready to admit her visitor.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Burton, Roland said. I hope I'm not intruding. I should have announced my intention to call, but I find that I need your advice on a matter of importance. Is it convenient to talk with you now?
Oh my, yes. Come in. We're free to talk with you any time, aren't we, Zachary?
She gave her somnolent husband a nudge with her foot.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Glad to see you. Won't you have a seat?
Mr. Brewer came right to the point.
Since you Christians are of some stature and this matter concerns your church, I thought you might be able to give me some assistance, he began. I understand that your church sustained some damage during the last storm and it has not yet been repaired.
That's true, Gladys nodded. And if you had any idea how hard it is to sit in those school seats every week, you'd wonder how we had any members left.
Mr. Brewer looked sympathetic.
Of course, I realize that must be so. Your young minister and his wife have come to me for aid. I had offered to provide shingles for the roof, but it seems, according to Mr. Gage, that Reverend Williams has some feelings that the entire building should be replaced.
Ha! Gladys snorted. Young ones are so impractical. That's a perfectly good church. Don't need anything bigger. If we kept the riffraff out, we'd be better off, I'll tell you. Have plenty of room, too.
Yes, I understand your feelings, Mrs. Burton. But before I make a decision about such a project, perhaps you could help me with some information.
Roland looked down at the floor and twirled his hat in his hands nervously.
This is a bit delicate to mention, he said slowly, and I hesitate to pry into affairs that are not my business, but Reverend Williams is coming to see me about this matter today, presumably to ask for more money.
He looked up at Gladys.
And, you know, I've not been in town long enough to know the background of all the people here. However, it has come to my attention that one of my employees has or had a more than casual interest in the minister. I don't like to suspect her, you understand, but she does have access to the payroll monies in the office, and she may be tempted.
Mr. Brewer managed to look most distressed, and Gladys hastened to comfort him.
You poor man, having to worry about this all by yourself. If I was you, I'd get rid of that Lawton girl as fast as I could. That is the one you were talking about, isn't it?
I don't like to name any individual, Roland replied. But I do appreciate your suggestion. I can't tell you how much better I feel for having talked with you, and I know it won't go any further than this room.
So you see, Gladys concluded resolutely, Mr. Brewer already had his suspicions about Miss You-Know-Who.
She looked triumphantly at me.
It didn't take him long to make a connection between that girl and the minister either. I'm glad no one can cast aspersions on my husband.
No one can cast aspersions on Mabel's husband either, Gladys, Augusta broke in sharply. You haven't reported what Zachary said about all this. Gladys had the grace to look chagrined.
Well, she said reluctantly, you know Zachary, he's inclined to be blunt. You know how he talks. He said he'd never heard such a trumped-up story, but I say that man never could see past the end of his nose.
In spite of this admission, Gladys was not willing to lose her attentive listeners. Eager to prove her point to the ladies surrounding her, she continued her narrative.
This isn't the first time I've told Zachary about what a gentleman Mr. Brewer is, and he shouldn't be surprised about the doings of that Lawton girl. Why, just the other day I said to him, Zachary, you'll never believe who was walking down the main street of town with Mr. Brewer. Bold as brass she was, Elizabeth Lawton. 'Tisn't the first time I've seen her hovering around where he was. She ought to be ashamed of herself. She cut into Gage's mercantile when she saw me coming. I'd have given her the edge of my tongue if I could have crossed the road fast enough, you can be sure. Such a nice man he is, with a family and all. He took off his hat and wished me good morning. Then he helped me down off the curb. North Branch doesn't have a lot of men who are that courteous. He is a fine addition to the community.
And what did Zachary say that time, Gladys?
Demanded Augusta. He'd fallen sound asleep, Gladys ended with disgust. Ain't that just like a man?
End of chapter 11.